This discussion is going to focus on the endocrine response to resistance exercise. So the next couple chapters are going to be kind of looking at how the body responds to various forms of physical activity here, starting with the endocrine system. It should be noted that, again, there's going to be a separate kind of ancillary lecture just strictly looking at the hormones. So one of the big things that you're going to be responsible for knowing out of this are all the different hormones, what endocrine glands they get released from, and what their responsibilities are in the body. Okay, so looking at the endocrine system, before we get into kind of some of the different hormones and what have you, the first thing we're going to talk about is what's called the general adaptation syndrome. So the general adaptation syndrome was an idea put together by a researcher by the name of Hans Selye, and it centers around our body's response to stress. And again, any type of stress doesn't differentiate between any of them, but it was kind of the simplest breakdown as to how our body kind of responds to stresses. And when you're talking exercise, any type of exercise is a stress to the body. The idea is we stress the body looks to adapt, and then not only adapts, but actually enhances whatever it is you're trying to do. So, I'm going to refer a lot of times in this case to resistance training because it's kind of what a lot of the focus of this particular chapter is on. So when you resistance train, the idea is you do your resistance training by lifting weights, and your body has adaptations. Your strength improves. You increase your lean tissue, and it does that because of that stress getting applied. So there's three stresses. There's three stages of the general adaptation syndrome. You start out with what's called the alarm phase, or the initial alarm phase. Some people also refer to that as the shock phase. And what that is when the stressor is actually applied. So the stressor is applied to the body. The second stage is what's known as the resistance phase. The resistance phase is where the body attempts to adapt. So let's draw this back. Now again, this idea corresponds to any type of stress to the body. I'm going to refer to it with resistance training because it's kind of more of the focus here. So you do your strength training session as you're applying all the stress, lifting the weights, whatever exercises you're doing. That's essentially a stress. You're stressing the body. Then once the body experiences that, it tries to adapt. We'll think of how the body adapts to you doing resistance training. Okay, so the body's going to try to make itself stronger. It's going to make the muscles grow, hypertrophy, as you go and do that. And the idea actually in this case is to actually go above baseline. So the body's trying to improve on that particular quality, or what we call supercompensate. Okay, that's stage 2. Now, the idea behind this is that the body is able to go above baseline. If for some reason the body is unable to adapt, you go into what's called the exhaustion phase. So, if you have someone who strength trains day in and day out, they maybe don't sleep good, eat right, they'll eventually reach the exhaustion phase because the body can't adapt. And this would go towards any type of stress. Too much of any type of stress to the body where you can't recover, you'd go into the exhaustion phase. In the case of training, it means you've officially overtrained, and you get into overtraining syndrome and all the issues associated with that. In the case of just other life stresses and things like that, this is where many times people will start to develop health problems and what have you. So you either have to adapt to the stress, or your body will kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of break down and start to develop issues if it goes into the exhaustion phase. Okay, so you have your 3 phases: your alarm phase, resistance phase, exhaustion phase. Okay, you don't want to get to the exhaustion phase. You want your body to be able to adapt, and particularly in the case of exercise, you want to be able to supercompensate while you do that. So looking at the endocrine system, and you can see on the slide here, you have all the different organs associated with the endocrine system, and there's the table, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, which will kind of summarize all of the hormones you have to know and what their responsibilities are, and we'll be hitting on some of them in the further discussion in this chapter, but you're going to be responsible for knowing all those endocrine hormones. There is also a an ancillary discussion on the endocrine system where I will actually go over all the individual hormones. So you'll be responsible for looking at that as well. The hormones are essentially chemical messengers in the body, okay? And they're basically stored and released into the blood by endocrine glands and certain other cells in the body. And we'll kind of talk about how the hormones get released later on. The endocrine glands are the specialized structures for releasing the hormones, okay? So again, if you look on this picture, you see all the different organs that are responsible for releasing hormones into the blood. And those hormones will go and they will react and cause different reactions in the body. And as you kind of look at all of the responsibilities of the hormones, you see how the endocrine system really is responsible for a lot of our functioning and kind of allowing our bodies to kind of maintain what they call homeostasis. So our bodies have homeostasis is basically like the resting kind of normal state of the body, and all these different hormones are kind of responsible for regulating that. Again, table 4.1 on page 67 is going to be a very important source. That table will actually show you all of the different hormones that you'll have to know. And again, there's also the other secondary talk on the hormones that you'll see on Blackboard that will further go over those hormones. So looking at the endocrine system, we're going to start out looking at the particular ways the hormones work. So we're going to kind of look at the way they kind of get released and travel in the body. So the term endocrine, when you're actually referring to how hormones work, that's when the hormones are actually released by a gland and then they travel through the blood circulation and then will act upon a receptor. Maybe it could be acting upon another. Sometimes you have situations where one endocrine gland actually releases a hormone that goes and interacts with another endocrine gland. And again, you'll kind of see that as you kind of look through and see some of the functions of some of these different hormones. That's what we call endocrine function. Intracrine and autocrine function is actually when you have the hormone gets released by a cell and then it actually acts on the cell that released it, okay? So in other words, you have a particular cell that will release a hormone. Well, that hormone actually goes right back in and then acts at that cell. And what it'll actually do is, in the case of intracrine, it will bind to the intracellular receptors or the receptors inside the cell, or in the case of autocrine, it'll bind to the membranes of the cell and then create a response. So your textbook gives the example of this being insulin-like growth factors. So insulin-like growth factors produce inside a muscle fiber, and then when it gets stimulated by resistance training, or in some case, or growth hormone, it will actually act upon the actual muscle cell, okay? So both intracrine and autocrine involve basically a hormone getting released and then it acts upon the cell that it was actually released by. So in this case, it never travels through the bloodstream. And then paracrine is when you have the hormone get released by a cell and it acts on an adjacent cell or a cell nearby. And again, in this case, you also do not have it moving through the bloodstream. So it's only endocrine function when it's getting released through the bloodstream and traveling through. In these other situations, you do not have a situation where it actually travels through the bloodstream. In the case of intracrine and autocrine, it's just acting on the cell that released it. In the case of paracrine, it's just acting immediately on a nearby cell. Okay, so again, it's going to kind of skip the hormones or it's going to skip the circulation and just kind of act in that manner. Many hormones affect multiple tissues. For instance, probably the best example of this is testosterone. Testosterone affects almost every tissue in the body when it gets released. So again, a lot of these functions of the hormones, it's important to really make sure that you understand the multiple interactions that they actually have. So obviously in regards to resistance training, we're looking at the muscle as the target for hormone interaction. So Very important. So when you go and strength train, you know, you're basically creating a situation where you're causing a disruption and damage to the muscle fiber, and you're actually producing a small inflammatory response. And the idea is what you're looking to do is get the muscle to remodel, to repair and replace the damaged proteins, and the hormone signals and everything will do that, will actually create that protein synthesis in order to help the muscle remodel itself. So that's, again, at a very basic level what we look to deal with. So, you know, hormones are very involved with the protein synthesis and degradation. Again, you know, the idea is when you're doing resistance training exercise, you know, you're essentially breaking down the muscle. And the idea is then during the recovery period, you know, the hormones that get released, they produce that remodeling response where in the end you get more protein synthesis into the sarcomeres, and then the muscle will grow. So this includes both the anabolic, the promote muscle building, and the catabolic process. So in order to have the anabolic process, the catabolism or the breakdown has to occur. So again, now it's a controlled process. You also have to make sure that you build recovery into that in order for the responses you want to have out of your resistance training to occur. This also kind of brings into play the concept of neuroendocrine immunology, and the reason for that is there's actually immune cells involved with this process. So your T cells and B cells, which are a part of your immune system, they will also interact. So really throughout the process of resistance training, you have an interaction between the nervous system, okay? So you have neural interaction, you have an interaction with the endocrine system, obviously with the hormones, and an immune response associated with this. So, you know, neuroendocrine immunology is an area of study that kind of looks at all that, and as we see with resistance training, you're going to have interaction between all of these different areas. So we look at the roles of receptors in kind of mediating hormonal changes. So you talk about, they call it the lock and key theory. And you can see in this picture, you see your receptors, you see various shapes of hormones and kind of how they look to do. So basically you have hormones and you have receptors. And basically what you're looking to have, what you see here is just kind of a schematic representation of kind of classic lock and key theory for hormonal interaction at the cell receptor level. So essentially you have hormones that are looking to affect cellular metabolism or the DNA transcription of the nucleus of the cell. And sometimes it, you know, beyond just the simple lock and key kind of a hormone finding a compatible surface area, many times the information also has to be transmitted via a secondary messenger, okay? So that's another thing to keep in mind. So even once the hormone kind of interacts, there's still a secondary messenger that sometimes has to be involved with this. So if you look here, you're seeing the idea of hormones looking to act with a specific receptor. Now, this is the entire process is slightly more complex than this, meaning that there are some other things beyond just straight up having a hormone and a receptor working, because you have the concept, and you can kind of see this illustrated here. There's the concept of cross reactivity. So in the case of cross reactivity, you sometimes have receptors that partially interact with other hormones. You also have what's called allosteric binding, and that's when substances other than the hormones can enhance or reduce cellular response to a primary hormone, okay? So in other words, when you're looking here, so this is an allosteric binding site, so these are the chemicals that interact. So in other words, there's substances other than hormones. So these are all hormones here, okay? Here they're showing you a bound hormone being transported. These are all hormones, but these are chemicals that will also interact with the receptors. And what you have with allosteric binding is that these other substances that aren't hormones will actually enhance or reduce response to the primary hormone. So if you're looking at this, here's your hormone A. So obviously hormone A, if you're looking at all these cell receptors, well, it would fit here. Well, what allosteric binding sites do is allows other chemicals to either enhance or possibly decrease the effect. So in other words, if this hormone comes down here and attaches and you get your response from it, these chemicals can actually either interfere or enhance the process associated with that particular hormone. Okay, so looking at the roles of receptors in mediating hormonal changes. So the receptors are going to play a major role in as far as how the hormones affect the body. The inability of a hormone to interact with a receptor is called downregulation. So this is something that could sometimes happen. And what occurs with this is that adaptation is no longer possible. So you see this in cases where the receptors might be overstimulated. Take in the case of when somebody develops insulin resistance. So if somebody, has a tendency as far as like diet and everything to eat, too much sugar and they're sedentary in life, particularly as they get older, they could end up developing insulin resistance and end up developing type 2 diabetes. So that would be an example of downregulation in the hormones. And then the alteration to the receptors' binding characteristics or the number of receptors can be as dramatic in adaptation as the release of increased amounts of hormones from an endocrine gland. So in other words, you can actually change the characteristics of the number of receptors, or over time through adaptation actually end up producing more of a hormone. Okay, so for instance, and it doesn't necessarily always has to be bad. So in other words, with downregulation, I gave the example of insulin resistance, which obviously could be a major problem. In the case of when you're looking at like better adaptations, for instance, when you're looking at testosterone and exercise, exercise training affects the maximal number, the number of receptors. So in other words, when you exercise, you'll actually increase the number of testosterone receptors in the body, which then again, there's beneficial effects to that. However, that does not affect the binding sensitivity. So that's just one of the adaptations or alterations that could happen as a result of exercise. So looking at categories of hormones, now again, make sure that you also review that endocrine gland video that I provided. That's kind of like an ancillary thing that will just kind of cover the individual glands, the hormones they produce, and some of the responses. We're looking in this discussion, we're looking more, kind of holistically at as how they are, the hormones affect the body as a result of exercise. So we look at steroid hormones. These are fat soluble and they passively diffuse across the cell membrane. So they will kind of passively cross the cell membrane. So here we're looking at the hormones from the adrenal cortex, particularly cortisol, and from the gonads, particularly testosterone and estradiol are the hormones we're going to be looking at here, and kind of some of the different responsibilities those individual hormones have. So this is a figure out of your textbook, and this is just kind of showing you how steroid migration into a target cell occurs. So they're just kind of showing one example. When you're looking at these different steroid hormones, there's other hormones to consider. One is the gonadotrophins. Gonadotrophins are a group of hormones secreted by the pituitary, which actually stimulates activity in the gonad. So that's actually what you're looking at here with luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is a gonadotrophin, and in this case, we're talking about the testes then being able to stimulate testosterone. Okay, so we talked about testosterone being the steroid hormone. So what this, one of the things testosterone does is it's responsible for virilization, which are the biological sex difference that makes males different than females. Females don't have as much testosterone in their body, so that's one of the kind of differentiating factors there as far as the physiology is concerned. So if you look here, what they're just kind of showing is how that gonadotrophin is going to stimulate the testes to produce testosterone, and then just kind of showing the testosterone kind of entering the cell, forming a hormone receptor complex, and then having your various effects that you would get as a result of that. Okay, so when you have that, it's going to diffuse across, form the hormone receptor complex, and bind and basically interact with the nucleus and the DNA of the cell to produce all of those different effects. So testosterone obviously produces various effects in the body. Females do produce testosterone, they just don't produce as much as males do. Another type of hormone interactions are what are called polypeptide hormone interactions. So some examples of these are growth hormone and insulin. They are not fat soluble, so they need a secondary messenger to kind of cross the cell membrane. So the steroid hormones are fat soluble. They can passively diffuse across the cell membranes. These need a secondary messenger in order to do so. So as you see in the illustration, okay, they're showing a typical polypeptide hormone interaction and what's required. So although it'll bind to an external receptor, you need a secondary messenger in order for it to enter and then interact with the cell nucleus. So unlike the steroid hormone, which will passively diffuse across the cell membrane, go in and interact with the nucleus and produce its effects, polypeptide hormones, again, growth hormone, insulin, they need a secondary messenger in order to activate the cell nucleus. So you don't have to worry about all of these little receptors that are present in here. So you don't have to worry about all this stuff. Just understand the fact that, so here's your receptor, the hormone interacts, and this is representative of growth hormone, but it can't enter the cell without the secondary messenger coming in and then being able to interact with the nucleus. Another category are amine hormone interactions. So these bind to membranes via secondary messengers as well, and they're not regulated by negative feedback. So these are hormones that are synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine. So examples of this are epinephrine, dopamine, tryptophan, serotonin. So what negative feedback refers to is a decrease in function in order to stabilize the system. So our body has two different types of feedback. They have positive feedback and negative feedback. Negative feedback is when the body's trying to decrease some function in order to maintain homeostasis or normal resting state. Whereas positive feedback will be something where the body increases the system, okay? So these hormones are not regulated by negative feedback. So they do not look to cause a decrease in function of the body. And again, refer to some of the stuff that we talked about as far as these the actions of the hormones are concerned. So there's, again, I refer you back to both the table in the book and also that little review video on how some of the different hormones work, but still be able to make sure you could classify these. So again, the amine hormones are epinephrine, dopamine, tryptophan, serotonin. Those are some of the different amine hormones. And again, they will also work via secondary messengers. So again, we're looking to try to find out, so beyond these very basics as far as like how receptors are going to work and these hormones, we want to kind of find out how this is involved as far as exercise is concerned, particularly heavy resistance exercise. So hormones are going to be secreted before, during, and after resistance exercise. And again, what you're essentially doing with resistance exercise is you're providing a physiologic stress that you want the body to accommodate to. Okay, so whatever your variables are, you're trying to improve. You're going to change your exercise routine to get those adaptations, and all it is a physiologic stress. So basically, you have an acute response regarding the amount of physiological stress. So in other words, as an example, when you start exercise, your body will release epinephrine, okay? That's something that, because of a physiological stress, your body's going to produce, okay? And your body will eventually create changes as a result of those various hormones that get released as a result of exercise. And that's not really any different than a lot of other physiologic processes. For instance, metabolic demands, okay, when metabolic demands change on the body, that's going to impact the amount of insulin you produce, okay? And then therefore your resting metabolism could also change as well. So as few as 1 or 2 heavy resistance exercise sessions can increase the number of androgen receptors. So remember we had talked about those receptors early on for testosterone could increase as a result of doing heavy resistance exercise. So the specific force produced in activated muscle fibers stimulate receptors and membrane sensitivities to anabolic factors, including different hormones which lead to muscle growth and strength changes. So that's what we're essentially looking to basically do and produce as a result of resistance training. And we have a balance between anabolic and catabolic reactions, okay? So there's going to be large forces produced during resistance exercise that cause stress and changes in the sarcolemma's ability to import nutrients and in the sensitivity and number of hormone receptors in the muscle cells. So, and again, you might have to go back and look at, well, you know, if you don't remember what the sarcolemma is, go back and look at that. But, you know, it's a combination of things that's going to do that, okay? There's also going to be a local inflammatory process that because of tissue damage, because we know when we strength train, we do produce small amounts of tissue damage, and then the repair mechanisms that are going to activate as a result of stress and through recovery is going to be what leads to greater growth and strength increases. However, if stress is too great, you end up not getting the remodeling process and the adaptations to occur the right way. In other words, if the catabolic reactions outweigh the anabolic, you won't get the benefit. So with this is also required a good amount of recovery in order to get the results from the strength training or the resistance training that you want. So the magnitude of the response, in other words, how well this good balance of anabolic and catabolic reactions will occur, depends on the amount of tissue stimulated, the amount of remodeling, and the amount of repair needed. Okay, so it's important to kind of balance out both getting a good amount of work in while at the same time making sure that you're getting appropriate recovery in order for the anabolic reactions to occur. So the actual physiologic stress of resistance training is going to be catabolic and break down muscle. The idea is that, you know, and obviously hormones play a big role with this, through recovery and also through things like nutrition and everything, which we'll talk about, you know, very briefly, that you get the right amount of muscle growth and strength changes. So the specific force produced in activated fibers will stimulate receptor and membrane sensitivities to anabolic factors, which includes hormones, and that could lead to muscle growth and strength changes as long as you have appropriate recovery from the exercise. So when we look at the mechanisms of hormonal interactions, okay, these mechanisms are dependent on several factors. So exercise is going to acutely, meaning immediately, increase blood concentration of hormones. The probability of interaction with receptors is possibly greater. So we know that exercise can stimulate certain hormones, okay? So obviously if there's more hormones getting circulated, you have a greater chance of them interacting with receptors. Because remember, the hormones still have to interact appropriately with the receptors as we discussed earlier. That's why we were discussing those hormone receptor interactions. So there's a combination of many different factors to stimulate muscle-induced hypertrophy. So in other words, there's various things that need to happen in order for this to occur. So one of them in particular is the neural activation of muscle fibers. So obviously we know that the nerves are going to cause activation in the muscle fibers. We talked about that in kind of our basic structure and function chapter. And that's going to increase the hormone binding affinity of receptors in the muscle. So that's one of the factors that's going to influence that. Another thing that's involved with that process is what's called molecular signaling, okay, with the hormones is also involved within the process. And again, that signaling is going to be influenced by those neural factors that I just talked about. So the neural activation of muscle fibers will increase that binding affinity, okay? So again, the nervous system is going to have a good amount of interaction as it relates to doing this. So it's a really important process that the neural factors or the nervous system will also help to augment the process. So you know, many times we talk about, you'll hear people refer to like neuroendocrine interaction, and this is very important. The hormonal mechanisms are also going to have differential effects based on program design, training level, gender, age, genetic predisposition, and adaptation potential. So in other words, things like genetics, the type of program you're doing are also going to impact this, okay? We even talk about if someone's close to their genetic maximum, so we talk about these receptors becoming more sensitive, and that will happen. However, for certain individuals, once they reach a certain point, they may not get as many benefits after a while, because if they're close to their genetic maximum, the receptors won't be as sensitive. Okay, so that's important to note as well. Another thing is that sometimes receptor desensitization can also occur due to chronically elevated hormones due to disease. So, you know, you can have some decreased sensitivity as a result of genetics, but that receptor desensitization could also occur due to chronic disease or even drug use. So one way we could kind of see how exercise is affecting the body is we can look at hormonal changes in the blood. Now, again, this is only one item that can be monitored, and again, it's not the only thing that's going to impact what the results are from exercise. Again, we have to still look at other factors. For instance, the impact of the nervous system, and then some other things that could impact as well. For instance, like the branched chain amino acid leucine and its interaction with, you know, things like muscle hypertrophy and recovery from the exercise. So the hormone concentration isn't the only thing that we look at. We also need to look at the just individual responses of the endocrine glands and the functional status of the receptors, okay? Now, because remember we said in order for the hormone to produce its effects, it has to interact with a receptor. Now, so the concentrations don't necessarily indicate the status. So we can tell that exercise is having an effect, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how much of an effect. So we could find that there's increases in hormone concentrations. However, that's not telling us how they're actually interacting with the cells via the receptors. However, in most cases, we're going to assume that if we have a large increase in hormone concentrations, that you're going to have a much higher possibility of interacting with the receptors. So you're kind of going off the assumption, well, if there's more hormones getting released, there's obviously a much better chance of that happening. However, like I said, you also kind of need information as far as how the different endocrine glands are working along with the actual functional status. So the outcome of the increase in hormones now kind of just depends on the status of the receptor in the target tissue, and also can the hormone signal actually be realized within the cell. So again, the increase in hormones can do something, but we still have to be able to know how they're actually interacting with the receptors. So another thing we have to look at with the hormonal changes in the blood is that we also have to look at, again, there's other physiologic mechanisms that contribute to the varying degrees of observed changes in blood hormone concentration. So in other words, exercise alone isn't going to be the only thing that impacts hormone secretion. So these are also other mechanisms that are going to contribute to how much hormones will be released into the blood. So your circadian pattern, so you got to look at how individuals are sleeping, fluid volume shifts, which can occur as a result of exercise, tissue clearance rates, so how the tissue's actually clearing the hormones, the venous pulling of blood, and then the hormone interactions with the binding proteins, okay? So when we're looking at some of this, again, for instance, going back to the fluid volume shifts, exercise tends to push fluid from the blood into the intracellular compartments. So that could possibly affect your hormone concentrations. The venous pulling of blood, again, will also kind of tell you how some of those circulatory mechanisms are working as well. So hormone responses are tightly linked to the characteristics of the training protocol, and that's another important thing as well, okay? So another thing to kind of note, given all of this, so an increase in hormone concentrations is not necessarily a prerequisite for seeing gains in muscle size or strength, because there's other physiologic adaptations that are going to be impacted as a result of the resistance training. So again, these are other factors. So again, this hormone interaction is kind of a complicated process. So it's important to kind of understand how they work, but realize there's other things that are going to impact the physiologic changes that occurs as a result of exercise. So if we look at how, again, the body tends to go through a lot of different adaptations as it relates to exercise, and just like all the other systems in the body, the endocrine system is going to adapt as well. So in regards to resistance training, we know that the muscle and the connective tissue are really the ultimate targets. And really, as far as how much the endocrine system is going to support what is needed is going to be basically going to also be impacted. We keep talking about how the training protocol will affect what type of impact the endocrine system is going to have. So the involvement of the endocrine gland is going to the endocrine glands is going to be really dependent on how much support is needed by the endocrine system to support what's going on. So for instance, your textbook gives the example of if you just do wrist curls, okay? So if you just take a light weight and do wrist curls, most of your normal homeostatic responses can support that. In other words, your body doesn't have to recruit a whole lot of its, that doesn't even need a big time impact from the endocrine system for an exercise that basic, okay? So it's a small amount of motor units getting recruited. You're really only recruiting the small muscles in your forearm to do it, and you're probably really only using light weights because you're going to be limited by the fact you're just doing a wrist curl. So the endocrine gland, you're not going to have a whole lot of endocrine gland activity. Some of the adaptations that are going to be needed can be pretty much just be met by what's in the muscle tissue and the motor unit demands. However, once we start to kind of change, volume of exercise and what they're doing, there's going to be adaptations that are possible from the endocrine system. So some examples that are possible: the amount and synthesis of and storage of hormones. So we know that we could, produce more hormones as a result of resistance training. The time needed for the clearance of those hormones through the liver and other tissues. How many receptors are in the tissue. Changes in the contents of the secretory cells in the gland. So that's another thing that could change. The degree of interaction with the cell nucleus, and that'll help produce changes. So these are examples of possible things that can happen as a result of changes in the endocrine system through resistance training exercises. So, and we talked about some of these things already, but these are kind of changes that can occur as a result of the appropriately prescribed strength training program. So just some other examples of some different adaptations that could occur in the endocrine system. So how much blood to tissue fluid shift occurs, how tightly the hormone will bind to the receptors, or an increase in the affinity. So the affinity is just the attraction between the hormone and the receptors. And then just the magnitude of the signal sent to the cell nucleus. So in other words, once the actual hormone enters into the cell, the actual signal that it sends to the cell nucleus to produce the response can change. So when we just look in general to kind of, summarize what hormones do for the body. So the hormones are secreted in order to maintain homeostatic control of the body. So if you remember going back to that video on the just basics of the endocrine system, these different hormones get released in order to make sure the body maintains normal homeostatic processes, okay? So we're looking to basically always have the body within a normal range of functioning, okay? And those homeostatic mechanisms controlled can be activated in response to both acute resistance exercise, so in other words, just the actual effects of the stress of an acute or immediate session, or they can also be altered by more chronic effects. In other words, if you resistance train consistently for a long period of time, you can get chronic adaptations to the endocrine system. Okay. Now they're both kind of regulated differently. So the mechanisms that mediate acute changes cause either a sharp increase or decrease in hormone concentrations, whereas more chronic changes tend to be a little bit more subtle. Okay. So in other words, when you do a workout acutely, the changes that occur in your body are much more dramatic than what would be the chronic resting hormone concentration. So those are two different types of effects and adaptations that will occur as a result of resistance training.